The lights in the ballroom were brighter than anything Elena had ever seen before. They hung from the high ceiling like giant crystals, catching every bit of shine in the room. It was a charity gala in the heart of the city, the kind of event where people donated more money in one night than most people saw in their entire lives. Elena stood near the entrance of the grand hall holding a glass of sparkling water she had no intention of drinking. Her palms were sweating and she kept wiping them on the side of her dress. It was a nice dress, the best one she owned, but looking around she felt it was made of rags compared to the silks and satins worn by the other women in the room. She felt small. Not just physically small but insignificant, like a single drop of water in a vast ocean. Everyone around her seemed to float with an air of confidence that she could not even fake. They laughed with their heads thrown back. They spoke about stocks and vacations and art auctions like they were discussing the weather. Elena tried to smile at a few people who passed by, but most of them looked right through her as if she were made of glass. It was a lonely feeling standing in a room packed with hundreds of people. Julian, her boyfriend, was across the room laughing loudly with a group of men in expensive tuxedos. He looked so comfortable in this world. He had grown up with money, with summer houses and private schools, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about a bill in his life. He was a good man, truly kind, and Elena loved him deeply, but moments like this reminded her of the massive gap between their lives. He had brought her here tonight to introduce her to his friends. He wanted to show her off. He thought the world would love her as much as he did. But watching him from across the room, Elena felt a deep pit form in her stomach. She felt like a fraud. She felt like a child playing dress up in her mother's closet, hoping no one would notice she did not belong. The air in the room smelled expensive. It was a mix of heavy perfumes, old leather, and the distinct scent of champagne. But underneath that sweet smell there was something colder. It was the smell of judgment. Elena could feel eyes on her as she stood alone near a tall potted plant. She did not know many people here. A few guests nodded at her politely, but their eyes were scanning her, taking in her shoes, her jewelry, her posture. They were assessing her value. In this room people were not just people, they were assets, connections, names on a list. And Elena felt she had very little value to offer them. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself that Julian loved her and that was all that mattered. She repeated this in her head like a mantra, but it did not stop the fear. Then she saw Victoria. Victoria was standing near a large ice sculpture holding court with a small group of women. Victoria was Julian's older sister and the unofficial queen of this specific social circle. She wore a long dark gown that looked like it was poured onto her, and her hair was styled in a way that seemed impossible for a human being to achieve. She was laughing, a high sharp sound that cut through the low hum of conversation in the room. Elena had met Victoria once before at a quiet family dinner. Victoria had been polite then, but her smile had never reached her eyes. It was a smile that looked at you like you were a bug she was deciding whether to crush or ignore. Tonight Victoria was looking right at her. Elena looked away, hoping to avoid eye contact, but it was too late. Victoria said something to her group and they all turned to look at Elena. Then Victoria started walking across the room. The crowd seemed to part for her like water. Elena gripped her glass tighter until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to run to the bathroom to hide until Julian came back, but her feet felt glued to the fancy marble floor. Victoria arrived in front of her with that same cold, perfect smile. She did not offer her hand to shake. She just stood there looking Elena up and down in a way that made Elena's skin crawl. "Well, well, look who it is," Victoria said, her voice smooth like silk but sharp like a knife. "You actually came. I was not sure Julian would convince you to leave your side of town." Elena forced a smile onto her face even though she felt like crying. "Hello Victoria," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "The party is beautiful. It really is." "Is it?" Victoria asked, looking around with a bored expression. "It is just the same old people drinking the same old wine, talking about the same old money. But I suppose for someone like you it must seem quite magical." She laughed a little, a short dry laugh that made the blood rush to Elena's face. Elena knew what Victoria was doing. She was reminding Elena that she did not belong here. She was pointing out the difference in their backgrounds without having to say a specific mean word. It was a game these people played. They used politeness as a weapon. Elena wanted to say something clever. She wanted to defend herself, but the words got stuck in her throat. She just nodded and looked down at her shoes. Just then Julian appeared at her side. He slid his arm around her waist, giving her a gentle squeeze. He looked happy to see them getting along, completely unaware of the tension in the air. "Victoria," he said, smiling broadly. "I see you met Elena." "We were just chatting," Victoria said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Elena was just telling me how amazed she is by all of this. It must be so overwhelming for her." Julian did not seem to hear the insult in her voice. He just squeezed Elena's waist again proudly. "She is doing great," he said. "Come on, I want to introduce you to some people from the club." He pulled Elena gently away from Victoria. Elena looked back once. Victoria was still standing there watching her go, a smirk playing on her lips. It was the look of a predator that had just cornered its prey. As Julian led her deeper into the crowd, Elena's anxiety grew heavier. She did not want to meet more people. She did not want to be stared at and judged by more strangers. She leaned in close to Julian so he could hear her over the music. "Maybe we can go soon," she whispered. "I am not feeling very well." Julian stopped and looked at her with concern in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Is it the heat? We can step outside for some fresh air." Elena shook her head. It was not the heat. It was the atmosphere. It was the feeling that she was a trespasser in a world where she was not welcome. But she saw the excitement in his eyes. He really wanted her to be part of this life. She did not want to be the girlfriend who ruined his night. "No, I am fine," she lied, trying to sound convincing. "Just a little tired." Julian smiled, relieved. "Good," he said. "Because dinner is about to be served and I have a seat for you right next to me at the main table." "The main table?" The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Elena looked over toward the center of the room. There was a long table set with white cloths and more silverware than she knew how to use. And sitting right there in the middle of it all was Victoria. Elena swallowed hard. She knew that the night was far from over. She had survived the greeting, but she could feel that something worse was coming. The way Victoria looked at her was not just dislike, it was a challenge. And Elena had a terrible feeling that she was walking right into a trap. She held onto Julian's hand and let him lead her to the table, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. The walk to the main table felt like the longest walk of her life, every step echoing on the polished floor. She pulled the heavy chair out and sat down, trying to make herself as small as possible. The table was set with terrifying precision. There were 3 different forks on the left side and 2 spoons on the right, and a small plate that looked like it was just for bread. Elena stared at the shiny silver, hoping nobody would notice her confusion. Across from her, Julian was laughing at a joke an older man in a tuxedo had told. He looked so relaxed, his jacket unbuttoned, one hand resting on the table. Elena wished she could borrow just a little bit of that calm for herself, but it felt miles away. The air around the table smelled of roasted meat and expensive red wine, but to Elena it just smelled like danger. She took a sip of water to wet her dry throat and looked around the table. There Were 10 people in total, and every single one of them looked like they belonged on the cover of a magazine except for her. Victoria sat 3 chairs down directly in Elena's line of sight. She was cutting a piece of steak with surgical precision, her eyes never leaving Elena's face. It was a stare that made Elena feel like she was being dissected. The servers moved like ghosts around the table, placing bowls of soup in front of everyone. Elena watched the others to see which spoon they used. It was the one on the far right. She picked it up carefully, trying not to let her hand shake. The soup was hot and flavorful, but it tasted like nothing to her because her stomach was in knots. The conversation started slowly, mostly about the weather and a recent golf tournament, but Elena could sense Victoria waiting for the right moment to strike, like a lion watching a gazelle drink from a water hole. Julian tried to include her in the talk, touching her arm gently and asking if she liked the soup. Elena nodded and gave a small smile, but she could not find her voice to speak. She just wanted the meal to be over. She wanted to go home and put on her old sweatpants and forget this night ever existed, but Victoria had other plans. The soup bowls were cleared away and the main course was served, a perfectly cooked piece of fish with vegetables arranged into a tiny tower. As soon as the servers stepped back, Victoria cleared her throat softly, but the sound carried through the small group. The chatter died down as everyone turned to look at her. Victoria put her fork down and dabbed her mouth with a napkin. Then she turned her cold eyes directly to Elena. "So Elena," she said, her voice smooth and loud enough for everyone to hear, "Julian tells us that you are quite the interesting person. He says you have a very unique perspective on life because of where you come from." Elena felt her face get hot. She nodded slowly, not knowing what to say. "That is so refreshing," Victoria continued with a tight smile. "Most of us here, we have been raised in the same boring circles. We went to the same schools. We travel to the same places. We have such a sheltered view of the world. It must be so freeing to not have those burdens, to not have the pressure of all that education and culture." The table went quiet. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when someone says something rude but everyone pretends they did not hear it. Elena looked at Julian, hoping he would step in, but he was just chewing his food, looking at Victoria with a blank expression. He did not seem to understand that his sister was tearing her apart piece by piece. It was not just what Victoria was saying, it was how she was saying it, with a fake curiosity that made Elena feel like a specimen in a jar. Victoria took a sip of her wine and leaned in closer. "I was just telling the group earlier," she said, "how terrible it is that we do not support the arts enough. We have this beautiful piano sitting in the corner over there, completely unused. The musician they hired cancelled at the last minute, something about a flu. Can you believe that?" Elena followed Victoria's gaze to the grand piano in the corner of the room. It was a sleek black monster shining under the spotlights. It looked lonely sitting there on the stage away from the tables. Elena knew that piano. She had seen it when she first walked in. She had felt a strange pull towards it, but she had forced herself to look away because she knew what touching it would mean. It would mean exposing a part of herself she had promised to keep hidden. Victoria smiled again, and this time the smile reached her eyes, but it was a cruel look. "You know," she said, "it is a shame that such a nice instrument is sitting silent. I bet in your world you do not see many instruments like that. I bet your music is more, you know, simple pop music on the radio or loud noise in bars." The people around the table chuckled politely. It was a sound that made Elena's skin crawl. Elena gripped her fork so hard her knuckles turned white. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, mixing with the shame. She wanted to stand up and scream at them. She wanted to tell them that she knew more about music than they ever would, but she stayed frozen. She remembered her promise to Julian to be on her best behavior, to not make a scene, but Victoria was not going to let it go. She waved her hand in the air vaguely toward the piano. "You know," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a loud whisper, "we should have some entertainment. I hate eating in silence. Why don't we have a little concert? Why don't we let Elena play for us?" The air left the room. Elena felt like she had been punched in the stomach. Her heart stopped beating for a second and then started pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Play," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, come now," Victoria said, laughing. "Don't be shy. It is just a friendly game. Surely you can hit a few keys. It can't be that hard. Even a child can play chopsticks." The table erupted in laughter, this time louder and more mean. It was not polite laughter anymore. It was the laughter of People who felt superior to someone else. Julian finally looked at Elena with concern in his eyes. He could see how pale she was. He could see her hands shaking in her lap. Victoria, that is not nice, he said, trying to sound firm, but his voice was weak. Oh hush, Julian, Victoria said, waving him off. She is fine, aren't you, Elena? We are all friends here. There is no need to be embarrassed. Just go up there and play something, anything at all. Elena looked around the table. Every face was turned toward her. Some were smiling, some were confused, but all of them were waiting. They were waiting for the show. They were waiting for the poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks to make a fool of herself. They wanted her to stumble. They wanted her to hit the wrong notes. They wanted to prove that she did not belong. Victoria had set a trap and Elena had walked right into it. There was no way out. If she refused, she would look rude and ungrateful. If she agreed, she would humiliate herself, because she knew they expected her to be bad. They expected her to have no talent. She looked at the piano again. It seemed to be calling to her, begging her to touch it. Her fingers twitched in her lap, aching to feel the keys. She thought about her childhood. She thought about the old upright piano in her neighbor's basement, the one she used to play until her fingers bled. She thought about the hours she spent practicing while other kids were playing outside. She thought about the scholarships she turned down because she was too scared to leave home. It was all locked inside her, a secret life that nobody in this room knew about. Victoria thought she was setting up a joke, but she was actually waking up a giant. Elena took a deep breath and slowly stood up. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced them to be straight. She pushed her chair back, the sound scraping loudly against the floor, making everyone jump. The laughter stopped instantly. The room was dead silent as Elena fixed her dress and looked Victoria right in the eye. There was no fear in her gaze anymore, only a cold determination that surprised even herself. If you want music, Elena said, her voice clear and strong, then I will play for you. Victoria raised her eyebrows, looking surprised that Elena had actually agreed, but her smirk quickly returned. She thought she had won. She thought she had broken Elena's spirit, but she had no idea what was about to happen. Elena turned away from the table and started walking toward the piano, her heels clicking on the marble floor. With every step she took, she felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. The anxiety was being replaced by something else, something powerful. She could feel the energy of the room behind her, all those eyes watching her, judging her, underestimating her. She reached the stage and stepped up onto the small wooden platform. The piano loomed over her, large and majestic. She sat down on the bench and adjusted the height. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood of the keys, closing her eyes for just a second to remember who she was and where she came from. She was not just a girlfriend of a rich boy. She was a musician, and she was about to show them all that money cannot buy talent. Elena sat on the narrow bench and the leather felt cool against the back of her legs. She placed her fingers lightly on the white keys, and for a moment she just sat there, letting the silence stretch out in the room behind her. She could feel hundreds of eyes burning into her back. It was a heavy feeling, like a physical weight pushing down on her shoulders. She knew exactly what was happening behind her. Victoria was likely leaning back in her chair with a satisfied smirk on her face, waiting for the first mistake, waiting for a sour note or a fumbled chord. The other guests were probably whispering to each other, placing bets on how long it would take for the poor girl to run off the stage in tears. They expected a nursery rhyme. They expected a simple and choppy melody that would prove once and for all that she did not belong in their world. But Elena did not move. She just took a deep breath and closed her eyes. For a second, she let the air fill her lungs and pushed away the fear. She pushed away the thought of Victoria and the expensive dresses and the judgmental stares. She thought only about the music. She thought about the old dusty piano in her neighbor's house where she spent every afternoon after school. She thought about the way the music used to make her feel safe when her parents were fighting. She thought about the scholarship she had earned but was too afraid to take. All of that talent and all of that passion had been locked away inside her for years, hidden behind a wall of shyness and insecurity. But tonight Victoria had broken the wall with her cruelty, and now there was nothing left to do but let the music out. Elena opened her eyes and her hands moved without her even thinking about it. She pressed down on the keys and the first note rang out clear and sharp, cutting through the stuffy air of the ballroom like a knife. It was a low note, deep and resonant, and it seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards. Then her right hand came down and a cascade of notes followed, fast and fluid like water rushing over rocks in a stream. It was not a simple pop song. It was not a childish tune. It was a complex and difficult piece, a classical etude that required strength and speed and a deep understanding of the instrument. The sound that filled the room was not hesitant or quiet, it was big and bold and demanding. It wrapped around the pillars and climbed up to the high ceiling. It drowned out the clinking of silverware and the low murmur of conversation. Instantly the room went dead silent, not the polite silence from before, but a shocked and heavy silence. The people at the tables froze with their forks halfway to their mouths. They stopped chewing and stopped swallowing and turned their heads toward the stage there, eyes wide with surprise. The sound coming from the piano was not what they expected. It was filled with a raw emotion that grabbed them by the throat and refused to let go. Elena's hands moved faster now, her fingers dancing across the keys with a precision that was terrifying to watch. Her left hand played a steady and driving rhythm while her right hand flew up and down the keyboard, playing intricate runs that sounded like falling rain, then crashing thunder. She did not look like the shy girl who had walked into the room afraid of her own shadow. She sat up straight, her shoulders back, her face calm and focused. She was in her element, she was in control. The piano was no longer a stranger to her, it was an extension of her body, an extension of her heart. At the main table Julian had turned his chair completely around. He was staring at the stage with his mouth slightly open. He could not believe what he was seeing. This was the girl he loved, but he had never seen this side of her. He saw the tension in her arms and the concentration on her face, and he realized he had underestimated her. He had thought he was protecting her by bringing her here, but she did not need protection. She had power he had never known about. It was like watching a quiet bird suddenly reveal that it was actually an eagle. He felt a surge of pride mix with his shock, but he also felt a pang of guilt for not knowing this part of her. Victoria was not smiling anymore. Her glass of wine sat forgotten on the white tablecloth. Her face was pale and her eyes were narrowed as she watched the stage. She was tapping her finger nervously on the table, a small betraying sign of her irritation. This was not supposed to happen. The plan was falling apart. The girl was supposed to fail. She was supposed to humiliate herself so Victoria could feel superior, but instead the girl was playing the most beautiful music Victoria had heard in years. The complexity of the piece was undeniable even to someone who did not know much about music. You could hear the skill in every note. You could hear the years of practice hidden behind the quiet facade. The music shifted, then becoming softer and more delicate. Elena's touch became gentle, the notes hanging in the air like crystal chandeliers. It was a haunting melody full of sadness and longing. It spoke of pain and of rising above it. The guests in the room were completely captivated now. Some of them had put down their forks entirely, others had turned fully in their seats to get a better look. The servers had stopped moving and were standing near the walls listening with their heads tilted. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. The judgment and the arrogance had been replaced by awe and curiosity. The social barriers seemed to dissolve in the presence of such raw talent. For a few minutes nobody cared who was rich and who was poor. Nobody cared about last names or bank accounts. They only cared about the sound. Elena let the music wash over her. She felt a rush of adrenaline that she had not felt in years. She was not thinking about the people watching her. She was thinking only about the story the music was telling. She poured all of her feelings into the keys, the frustration of feeling like an outsider, the anger at being looked down upon, and the deep burning desire to prove herself. She played with a fire that made the piano seem to come alive. The instrument vibrated under her hands, responding to her every mood, her every whim. She was not just playing notes, she was painting a picture with sound. She moved into the final section of the piece. The tempo increased again, becoming faster and more intense. The music built up layer upon layer of sound, growing louder and more powerful. It was like a storm approaching on the horizon, dark and inevitable. Her hands were a blur now, moving so fast they were almost invisible. The sound was huge, filling every corner of the vast hall. It demanded attention, it demanded respect. The people in the front rows could actually feel the sound waves hitting their chests. It was a physical force that would not be ignored. Elena's heart was pounding in time with the music. She felt powerful, she felt invincible. She was not the girl from the wrong side of the tracks anymore. She was a musician and this was her domain. The tension in the room was at a breaking point. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the climax. They were leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed in the performance. Even Victoria was watching, unable to look away, her face a mask of shock and confusion. The trap she had set had been sprung, but she was the one caught in it. The room was no longer hers, it belonged to Elena and the piano. The music swelled to a crescendo, a roaring wave of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, and then with one final powerful chord Elena brought her hands down hard on the keys and the music stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy and thick and seemed to last for an eternity. The final chord seemed to hang in the air, vibrating and slowly fading away until there was nothing left but the ghost of the sound. Elena sat there with her hands still resting on the keys, her chest rising and falling fast. She slowly opened her eyes and looked out at the crowd. For the first time since she started playing, she saw hundreds of faces staring back at her, but they were not looking at her with judgment or mockery anymore. They were looking at her with wonder and disbelief. The spell was broken. The outsider had become the center of their world, and nothing would ever be the same again. The air in the massive ballroom was so thick and heavy it felt like time had stopped completely. Not a single person made a sound, not a cough, not a whisper, not the clinking of a fork against a glass. Everyone was frozen in place, suspended in the moment. Right after the final note had faded away, the piano strings were still vibrating deep inside the wooden body, humming with a ghost of the sound that had just filled the space. Elena sat on the bench with her hands resting lightly on her knees, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She felt like she had just run a long race. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her mind was strangely clear and sharp. The fog of anxiety and self-doubt that had plagued her all evening had completely vanished, blown away by the force of the music. She looked out at the sea of faces and saw that they were not looking at her with pity or amusement anymore. They were looking at her with total shock. Their mouths were slightly open, their eyes wide and unblinking. They had expected a simple tune. They had expected a clumsy performance full of mistakes that would confirm their beliefs about her, but instead they had witnessed a masterclass in emotion and skill. The transformation was complete. The girl who had walked into the room afraid of her own shadow was gone, replaced by a woman who commanded the entire space simply by being herself. The power in the room had shifted instantly and violently. Then a sound broke the silence. It was the sound of a single pair of hands clapping slowly and rhythmically. It came from the back of the room near the bar where a young waiter had stopped working to listen. He was clapping with genuine enthusiasm. His applause sounded loud in the quiet hall like a heartbeat. Then another person joined in, a man in a gray suit sitting near the back, then a woman near the front, and then suddenly the whole room erupted. It was not a polite golf clap that you give out of obligation. It was a roar of appreciation, a wave of sound that washed over the stage. People started standing up one by one until the whole room was on their feet. The applause was deafening. It was a wall of sound that bounced off the high ceilings and the crystal chandeliers. Julian was the first one at his table to stand. He was clapping so hard his palms were stinging. He had a huge grin on his face. His eyes were shining with tears. He had never felt prouder of anyone in his entire life. He looked at the stage and saw not just a girlfriend but a force of nature. He realized how wrong he had been to worry about her fitting in. She did not need to fit in. She stood out all on her own. She had more talent in her little finger than everyone in this room combined. He felt a surge of love so strong it almost knocked him over. Victoria was the only one who remained seated for a long moment. Her hands were gripping the edge of the white tablecloth so hard her knuckles were turning white. Her face was a mask of cold fury and disbelief. She felt the control slipping through her fingers like water. Her plan had backfired spectacularly. She had tried to make Elena look small and foolish, and instead she had made her a star. Victoria felt a burning sensation of jealousy in her chest. She had taken years of expensive piano lessons as a child and could barely play a simple scale, while this girl nobody had poured her soul into the keys and created magic. Victoria wanted to scream, but she just sat there seething. Elena slowly stood up from the piano bench. The applause washed over her like a warm rain. She felt a lightness in her step that had not been there before. She took a small bow, not a deep theatrical bow but a simple nod of gratitude to the audience. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The music had said it all. She turned and began to walk back toward the main table. The crowd parted for her as she walked, but this time it was different. This time they were not making space to avoid her like she was contagious. They were making space to let her through. They were looking at her with new eyes, with respect and awe. As she walked across the marble floor she felt the eyes of the room on her, but it did not bother her anymore. She held her head high, her back straight. She walked with the grace of a queen returning to her castle. The distance between the stage and the table felt short, but in that walk she replayed the last 10 minutes in her mind. She had let the barriers down, she had stopped pretending to be someone she was not, and it had set her free. The fear of judgment had vanished because she knew she had given them something real, something that no amount of money could buy. She could see Julian beaming at her, his face glowing with love and pride. He reached out a hand as she got closer, wanting to pull her into a hug, but Victoria was sitting right there blocking the way. Victoria's face was pale and her lips were pressed into a thin hard line. She looked like she had swallowed a lemon. The air around the table was electric with tension. The contrast between Julian's joy and Victoria's anger was sharp and visible. Elena felt strong. She realized that Victoria's opinion meant nothing to her anymore. The woman who tried to embarrass her was just a bitter person with too much time and money. Elena reached the table and stood for a moment looking down at Victoria. She did not gloat, she did not smile smugly, she just looked at her with a calm and steady gaze that showed no fear. The silence at the table was deafening compared to the roar of the room. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Would Victoria apologize? Would she say something mean? Would she ignore what just happened? Elena took a deep breath and pulled her chair out. She knew that the dynamic had shifted forever. The power was no longer in the hands of the rich bully, it was in the hands of the girl who played the piano. She sat down slowly and Julian immediately took her hand under the table, squeezing it tight. Victoria looked away, unable to handle the eye contact. Elena picked up her glass of water and took a sip, feeling the cool liquid calm her throat. She was ready for anything now. Elena sat back in her chair and took a slow breath. The air around the table felt different now. It was lighter, less heavy with judgment. Victoria was staring at her plate, pushing a piece of fish around with her fork, but she was not eating. Her face was flushed, a deep shade of red which clashed horribly with her expensive dress. She could not bring herself to look up at Elena or Julian. The power had completely shifted from her to the woman she had tried to shame. It was a crushing defeat for someone who valued her social status above all else. Julian was beaming. He looked at Elena as if he was seeing her for the very first time. He squeezed her hand under the table and leaned in close. "That was amazing," he whispered, his voice full of wonder. "I had no idea you could play like that. Why didn't you tell me?" Elena looked at him and saw only love and curiosity in his eyes, no judgment, no feeling of being left out, just pure amazement. She smiled back at him, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I wanted to keep it a secret," she whispered back. "It was part of my old life and I wanted to just be your girlfriend, not a performer, but tonight changed everything." Before Julian could say anything more, a man from the next table stood up and walked over to them. He was older, with gray hair and a very expensive suit. Elena recognized him as one of the men who had ignored her earlier in the evening. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Elena directly and completely ignoring Victoria. "That was the most beautiful thing I have heard in years, truly remarkable." He bowed his head slightly out of respect. Victoria looked up sharply, shocked that he was speaking to Elena and not her, but the man did not even glance in her direction. Soon other people began to approach their table. A group of women from the charity committee came over. They were smiling warmly, all traces of their earlier snobbery gone. "Thanks to Elena's talent you have a gift, dear," one of them said. "You simply must play at our next fundraiser. We would be honored to have you." Elena nodded politely, accepting their compliments, but inside she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had won their respect, not with money or connections, but with raw and undeniable talent. Victoria could not sit there anymore. She stood up abruptly, causing her chair to scrape loudly against the floor. The sound was harsh and jarring in the happy atmosphere. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight and strained. "I have a headache. I need some air." She did not look at anyone. She just turned and walked away quickly, heading towards the exit. Her posture was stiff and her head was held high, but everyone could see she was fleeing the scene. She could not handle being the second most important person at her own table. She could not handle watching the woman she tried to destroy being celebrated. Julian watched his sister go with a sigh. He knew she had been cruel and he knew she had been beaten. Let her go, he said softly to Elena. She needs some time to think about her behavior. Elena just nodded. She did not feel sorry for Victoria. She felt a sense of peace. The night that had started with so much anxiety had turned into a victory lap. She realized that the only person who could make her feel small was herself, and by letting the music out she had broken that spell. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur for Elena. People kept coming over to talk to her, asking about her music and her life. She answered them simply and honestly, enjoying the conversations. For the first time that night she was not pretending to be someone she was not. She was just being herself, and it was enough. Eventually Julian stood up and helped Elena with her chair. I think we have had enough excitement for one night, he said, smiling. Do you want to go home? Elena nodded eagerly. She was tired, but it was a good tired, a satisfied tired. They said their goodbyes to the people at their table, ignoring the empty seat where Victoria had sat. As they walked towards the exit, the crowd seemed to part for them again, but this time it was out of respect. The doorman held the heavy door open for them and gave Elena a little nod of recognition as they stepped out into the cool night air. The city was buzzing with life, and the street lights cast long shadows on the sidewalk. The walk to the car felt refreshing after the stuffy ballroom. Elena took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cool air. She felt light, like a heavy weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Julian opened the car door for her and she slid inside. The leather seat felt comfortable as Julian got in on the other side. He started the car but did not drive immediately. He turned to look at her. I am so sorry, he said quietly, about tonight, about Victoria and the way she treated you. I should have stopped her. I should have known better. Elena reached over and took his hand. It is okay, she said softly. If she had not done what she did, I would never have played. I would have stayed in my shell all night, maybe forever. Julian squeezed her hand. I never knew you had that kind of passion inside you, he said. It makes me love you even more. Elena smiled, looking out the window at the passing buildings. She thought about the piano and how it felt to play again. She realized that she had been hiding a huge part of who she was because she was afraid of being judged, but tonight she learned that her talent was nothing to be ashamed of. It was her strength. It was the thing that made her unique and valuable. As they drove home, Elena felt a new sense of confidence settle over her. She knew that there would be other galas and other difficult social situations, but she would never feel like an outsider again because she carried her own worth in her hands and in her heart. The music had set her free, and she knew she would never play small again for anyone. The lights of the city blurred past them, creating a stream of color against the dark sky. Elena closed her eyes and let the memory of the music wash over her. One last time she had gone into the lion's den and she had come out as the lioness. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet power that no one could take away from her. She had faced her worst nightmare and turned it into her greatest triumph. And as they pulled into the driveway of their home, Elena knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter where she would never be afraid to let her true self shine. The piano had given her back her voice, and she intended to use it from now on, no matter where she was or who was watching. She was Elena the musician, and she was finally free.